All right. Just so you know, Jay, we're recording now, and so Jay, welcome back to the Gnostic Media podcast. You and I were going to record tomorrow, but we had a conversation yesterday and again today, and we've got so much good material here that we decided to record it and make this the interview. So we're going to sort of do a recap on the things we've just been discussing over the last 20 minutes regarding Fernando Benitez and Wasson, and your discoveries primarily, as well as we're going to be covering my new article. And just so you know, Jay, I think it was your suggestion, I changed the name to Spies in Academic Clothing.
Yes, that title makes so much sense to me because, you know, what most people know about MK are the medical experiments and the army experiments where people are given LSD or electroshock, as was the case in Canada, in order to reprogram them. Basically, what we're talking about is mind control, big time. And most people know about that and Frank Olson, but that's really the tip of the iceberg, as you and I well know. But at any rate, we have medical doctors and psychiatrists pretending to be like all other medical doctors and psychiatrists, when in fact they were CIA agents or intelligence agents. And then we had the same thing in academia. Wasson wasn't an academic, and yet he was cited by people that were, and he was actually an opinion leader. So,
Well, we should mention why he was an opinion leader. He was actually the vice president of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank, and he worked directly with Edward Bernays.
Exactly, and he was on the Council of Foreign Relations. He was not just an ordinary intelligence agent. He was one of the top people in the whole MK project of mind control at the social level.
Exactly. So let me ask you, Jay, since we were talking for a bit here before we started recording this, where did you want to start? Did you want to start off with the article, or what we were just discussing regarding Fernando Benitez?
Well, I think Fernando Benitez is important in all of this. The overview that I think is needed here is that there seem to be three waves of archaic revival that stimulate tourism in Mexico and stimulate, for lack of a better word, the New Age seekers in the United States, Europe, and Mexico, and all over nowadays. So what are those three waves? The first was the Mazatec tourism that Wasson and Benitez actually set off. And then the second would be the Huichol tourism that's still going.
And that's the peyote tourism.
That's with peyote, with first Meyerhoff and Castaneda being the primary drivers there, and Benitez helping. And then the third and last one is in 2012 with all of this New Age nonsense that was centered on the Mazatec that went back to Michael Coe, evidently.
You mean on the Maya, going back to Michael Coe?
Exactly.
And his 1966 book, The Maya.
Right. So we have three different waves of, I would say, intelligence-inspired tourism that were directed at Mexican Indians, but that were directing non-Indians to go there for enlightenment, ecstasy, whatever they call it. It's just not shamanism.
All right. So why don't you tell the audience what you discovered about Benitez's background?
Well, it's interesting to me. I'd only read the part of Benitez that pertained to the Huichol. So what I immediately discovered, I found his obituary in the New York Times. And the New York Times does not mention the fact that Benitez was very well connected to the Mexican government. And in 1946, he was appointed, the personal secretary to the interior minister. Now, why is 1946 important? Because they were about to build a huge dam that would involve relocating some 22,000 Mazatec Indians.
And
so
this is
from the beginning, he was involved in the relocation of the Mazatec.
Right. And so this is a part of the scam that we have to point out regarding the Mazatec Indians and the quote-unquote sacred mushrooms, because by 1947, the dam project had begun.
Exactly.
And then in 1953, was it, that the Mazatecs were flooded? And so the Mazatec had been relocated. And so then when Wasson and Wheatlander go there in 1953, this is after the dam project, after they've been relocated. So this is not an accurate ethnography of the Mazatec people, because it's happening after all of this stuff occurs. But interestingly, until you told me about the dam project yesterday, in all of the 30 or 40 books I've read on Wasson and the Mazatec and this whole area, I have never, ever once seen anything about the dam project or relocation mentioned.
Nor had I, because I was focused on the Huichol. I didn't dig deeper until now to see what was going on with the Mazatec. And yes, this dam and the relocation it caused were of incredible importance to anyone that pretended to be interested in studying the mushroom ceremonies.
So, in your opinion, as a professor of anthropology, do you think that you could possibly provide an accurate ethnography of a tribe of people without discussing their relocation and the dam project?
Well, it certainly had an impact on what their needs were economically. Their religious needs, I don't think, changed very much. But if we talk about the fact that they have to survive, then to leave that out is a very significant omission.
And we already saw that Wasson had manufactured the Mazatec religion, contradicting Maria Sabina's own statements that they had never used the mushrooms to find God, but only for healing and for finding a missing jackass, finding stolen money, finding someone who's gone off into the world.
Right.
There were only 5 or 6 uses that the Mazatecs used them for. UFOs and aliens are never mentioned, like the McKenna crowd wants us to believe.
Hell no. Listen,
but God was never mentioned in any of those uses, or even religious purposes for the Mazatec. They used them for healing and for other purposes, for medicinal purposes.
It was for healing and for divination, finding answers to questions that were significant to people that went to Maria Sabina or to whatever shaman they needed help from. And it was done only at the request of someone who had a problem, whether it was medical or finding out where a stolen piece of property was or a missing relative. Yeah, that's right.
Right. So, so they misrepresent the Mazatec religion, which Maria Sabina actually admitted that she was Catholic, and all of her so-called veladas are composed of words of Christian saints and Jesus, or the names of Christian saints and Jesus. And so, Wasson repeatedly calls them veladas. He creates this fancy name for them, etc. But, he's essentially misrepresenting that whole thing. And that was covered in my article. The details of this were covered in my article in Theogens, What's in a Name, that I published in November. And so what we're discovering, one comment that I made in Theogens, What's in a Name, was that Benitez may have been a willful idiot, or a dupe, rather than actually knowing that he was committing this fraud. In the article, I say, the question then becomes, was Benitez a willful idiot, or like Fierce, Meyerhoff, Castaneda, Wasson, and apparently Ruck, a willful participant? And so what you're discovering is that it looks like Wasson was using Benitez. Would you agree with that?
Maybe using is a little bit strong. What I think is that Benitez considered Wasson to be the expert because
and just passed authority to Wasson on the topic, right?
Yeah, I mean, because by 1961, who didn't consider Wasson the expert on the magic mushrooms of Mexico,
Now,
right?
right. Now, one thing that we need to mention here that you discovered last week was that, and last week you thought Benitez was probably working with the Mexican government or the CIA or something. So, but after reading more of his book, you think he's more accurate. So, he also worked for the National Indigenous Institute, or Instituto Nacional Indigenista, for the Mexican government, which he was located. What was he? The director?
Yeah, what happened is
But
after relocation occurred, and that started in 1953. The first group of 3,000 Mazatecs were relocated in 1953. So from then on, they were relocating the 22,000 Mazatecs. But Benitez was appointed in 1960 to be the director of this Instituto Nacional.
And so this is very important. Where was he
in
appointed?
Huautla
In
de
Huautla
Jimenez.
de Jimenez, right?
In
Where
1960.
Maria Sabina lived. So if he was appointed there, then would it be accurate to say that he was probably there when Wasson and Wheatliner were there the first time?
It is a possibility.
Because that was 1953 when they met up with Aurelio, and you discovered that, and I think Andy Letcher or somebody discovered that Wasson had 4 or 5 shamans that he had met up with, but you discovered that there were actually 7, Aurelio just 1, and then Maria Sabina being the final selected one. And obviously Maria being Mary was more of a spiritual persona that Wasson could sell, whereas Aurelio was the one-eyed butcher from Huautla de Jimenez and sounded more like Jack the Ripper.
There had to be some kind of consideration of charisma or public image that involved a choice between Maria Sabina and other ritual healers, shamans, for lack of a more accurate word in their language, because I don't know their language. But yeah, there had to be something other than just their ability to perform the ceremony that pushed them toward Maria Sabina instead of one of the other 6 or 7.
Now, Wasson claims that all of the other shamans that he found before Maria Sabina were all frauds, but does he give any evidence or explanation as to why they were frauds and why he dismissed them?
No, there's no evidence given. Well, actually, there's a tiny bit of evidence given in the 1957 magazine article, but it's not enough to convince me, especially because Aurelio, the first Mazatec shaman that Wasson consulted, Aurelio was able to divine certain things about Wasson's son going into the military and one of Wasson's relatives having a heart attack that clearly show that he had shamanic power to see what was unknown to normal people. So Wasson did not explain sufficiently to me why it is we should toss Aurelio in the trash can and simply replace him with Maria Sabina.
Now, I suppose the question then becomes, with this divining, why didn't Aurelio know that Wasson was CIA and Council on Foreign Relations and wanted to do all of this dishonest stuff? And I mean, and you and I can agree to disagree on the point of, if the divination was accurate or not, if he was pulling up real stuff or, whatnot.
But let's also disagree on this. Here's a possibility, just as humorous as it probably will sound to you, is maybe Aurelio did figure out that Wasson was not who he was claiming to be. Maybe it was Aurelio getting rid of Wasson.
And then, and then we still have the next 5 or 6 shamans after Aurelio.
Yes, that's right.
And do you know who any of these other shamans were? Do we have any information on them?
As far as I know, the only other Mazatec healer, other than Maria Sabina, that Wasson identified was Aurelio. But I'm not an expert on all of this other literature that has come down from other people that you could cite better than I, that specifically talks about the other Mazatec mushroom ceremonial specialists. But as in 1957, in the popular magazine article, it's only Maria Sabina, and then I think it's in the Wondrous Mushroom probably, or Persephone's Quest, that Wasson talks about Aurelio.
Now, let me read you what Dr. Andy Letcher says in Shroom, and he exposed a lot of Wasson's fraud regarding this, but he did not expose that Wasson was CIA, MKUltra, Subproject 58, etc. And he says that Wasson was captivated by her, Sabina, seems understandable given the qualities charismatic. What is less understandable is why he dismissed other curanderos he encountered as second-rate practitioners of a degenerate tradition. Their standing was as high as Sabina's within their respective communities.
I have no reason to dispute that. I don't know any better, and I the only thing I can say is, why Maria Sabina and not someone else? Because for the Huichol, there's clearly a hierarchy of prestige when it comes to ritual practitioners that everybody in the community used to know about. Nowadays, it's probably confused. But when I went there, people immediately said, Decawitero, this is the man that you want to talk to because he knows the rituals better than anybody else. So that I'm sure it must have been like that in 1953. It must have still been like that with the Mazatec.
And, so what we have here then is, Wasson dismissing all of these people. Wasson is, again, a PR expert, a marketing expert.
Yes, exactly.
Hung out with Bernays that we know of for at least a decade.
Yes.
And so we know that, being that he's a marketing and PR guy, Maria Sabina must have been selected.
I believe that.
And we also know that Wasson committed academic fraud on all of his research regarding the Mazatec. And I think you said Huichol a minute ago. So,
well, he didn't do anything.
So Maria Sabina, her name is Mary. It sounds religious. It sounds, spiritual, compared to Aurelio, the one-eyed butcher. And of course, Maria Sabina is called Maria Sabina the Sabia. Right. So, so he adds this extra special word, and then he automatically uses, magic, mushrooms, and all of these loaded terms to market these substances. And then, of course, the Life magazine article from 1957 that you just mentioned was published by Henry Luce, who worked, of course, with the CIA and with Wasson at both the Century Club and the Council on Foreign Relations, and we do have the primary documents for that.
Right. Well, it's clear Maria Sabina was selected. One other reason for that, or maybe evidence for that, is either a reason or evidence, is that Aurelio is called a witch, and he's supposedly responsible for, according to Benitez, for having a bad trip when Benitez for the first time took the mushrooms. And so there's this side of shamanism that you and I have briefly touched on, which is that if you can heal, you can also harm people. And in many societies, the shaman is feared as well as loved, the same person. So I think since Maria Sabina wasn't called a witch, they're saying, well, Aurelio, is questionable because he can harm people, not just heal them.
Well, and the shaman's plants, usually the difference between a poison and a medication is just dosage.
It can just be dosage in some cases, yes. So, there's no doubt that there was some reason it was Maria Sabina and not Aurelio or one of the several other healers that he could have selected.
Now, you're still reading this book, and this is Fernando Benitez's book, and it is in Spanish.
Right.
And there's actually 5 volumes to this set,
Right.
Los Indios de Mexico. This is volume number 3,
Yes,
just so
that's
people
correct.
know. And
Yes.
I am hoping to get a little section of this translated so that we can get some more info out of it for the public. But unfortunately, Benitez's 5 tomes on the Indians of Mexico has never been translated into English, even though he's heavily cited.
The one that is well known in English is In the Magic Land of Peyote. That was translated.
Oh, yes, that's true. I
Yeah.
do have that one.
And I think there's something on Maria Sabina in English too.
Well,
But
there is the work that Dr. Brian Akers, who I exposed in Entheogens, What's in a Name, he had translated a number of, or at least one of Benitez's articles on Sabina and the mushrooms.
But what's significant about the fact they haven't been translated is that Benitez was not just an author and historian. He wasn't, yes, of course, he wasn't a trained anthropologist, but that probably was all to his credit because he was working for the government of Mexico and he knew what was going on in the day-to-day lives, not just the ecstatic, far out tripping kind of stuff that supposedly the shamans are involved in. He knew about the economic hardships, the diseases, the battle between the church and the state. He knew what the reality was. And it's interesting that doesn't get published in English.
All right, so let's see. We're going to mention some other stuff about Benitez here. And, so let's get into the evidence that you have that he was a dupe or a willful idiot and not a participant.
Well, I think he was actually a sincere official within Mexico's government. He came from an affluent family. He was very well connected politically. I mentioned in 1946 he was already being positioned to take care of this relocation project that was going to go on after the dam was constructed. So he was well connected. It doesn't mean he was part of the intelligence movement. Because he was very interested in economic issues with the Mazatec. That was his main concern, is making sure they got paid enough for the coffee that they were producing up in the highlands at Huautla de Jimenez. And so we start with maybe a brief explanation, which is the dam that they built, the Miguel Alemán Dam, named after one of their presidents, was built in the lowlands, of course, where the water is draining down and possibly flooding if it's not controlled, they said. Of course, it was a hydroelectric project to generate electricity. But anyway, so the 22,000 Mazatecs that were living in the lowlands where the dam was going to flood their lands had to be relocated. And the economic damage to those 22,000 was pretty severe because, as in all of these big development projects, it's the rich that benefit, not the poor. So there were all these Mazatecs that didn't get land that was equivalent in value to what they had left behind when they got flooded. They didn't get compensated, many of them, for the crops, the trees that they had, or the animals that were left behind. So they were harmed economically. So the government had to do something to mitigate this harm, and that's where Benitez was directly involved in the relocation of the lowland Mazatec up into the highlands. Some of them went up there. And then the highlanders had always been, poor, because their lands were not as rich up in the mountains, and the steepness of the mountains meant that they couldn't grow as much as the lowlanders. So he was there primarily for economic development. But this is where the segue goes right into what we want to talk about.
Right.
What's a form of economic development? Tourism.
Well, and so we should talk about the fact that the Mazatec, their primary source of income was coffee and wine. And so, so a lot of, apparently, Benitez says that these industries weren't harmed because they were in the highlands. I guess when the dam flooded the region. So he comes in and he's working for this government institute, and he's focused on creating an economy. Now he starts to meet with one shaman, and then all of a sudden, serendipitously, Wasson shows up and tells him, cancel your appointment with that shaman. You got to go to my shaman.
Exactly.
And then Wasson sends Fernando Benitez to Maria Sabina, and then that's where he meets her. And there's this talk of overcoming an old distrust and all of that from Wasson. But, so here is Fernando Benitez concerned about the economy for the Mazatec, and then Wasson comes along and essentially creates a tourist industry for the mushrooms and the fake Mazatec religion that Wasson then created and sold on top of the Mazatec. And then all of a sudden they have this whole money thing going on in there. And then, I talked about in my article, Gordon Wasson, The Man, the Legend, the Myth, was it, about economics. But also at the same time, as you and I have discussed in prior articles, this also caused a reverse backlash of Native revivalism into the United States and across Mexico, for that matter.
And across Mexico. I don't know about the wine. Going back to the coffee. Coffee was the main thing. I don't think wine was significant as far as I know, but
I have seen wine mentioned in a number of places in there.
Okay, then I can't disagree then. But at any rate, the coffee was what Benitez was talking about with his help to the coffee producers in the highlands around Huautla de Jimenez. But our main point is, yes, the tourism. And of course, if you think about it, why would Wasson?
Sorry, real quick. He talks about the winery of Bemex. Sorry, right?
Oh, wait. Bemex. That's the government. That's the government agency that supports the coffee producers, the Mazatec coffee producers. That's exactly the name of the government agency that Benitez was involved with. Exactly, Bemex.
Okay.
So it wasn't wine, it was coffee. But okay, the main thing here is what else besides coffee could they export or could they make money on? And one of the things had to be the tourism. So bringing all of these non-Indians in, of course, was a form of economic development. And I don't know exactly what Benitez knew about Wasson's great plans, whatever they might have been. But clearly it was going to be of benefit to some of the Mazatecs to have those non-Indians coming in and buying food and staying somewhere and paying for a mushroom ceremony and so on. And it made sense to basically for Wasson to steer Benitez away from any other shaman, because the way publicity works, as you know, is you create a celebrity that becomes an index of what supposedly all of the other shamans are doing, the best example of it. And so Maria Sabina was selected for whatever reasons. So it made sense to try to get Benitez on board and on the same page and have him do another study of Maria Sabina that would be published in Spanish.
I'm just thinking about this. This is an exact mirror of what took place in Peru and Brazil, et cetera, with ayahuasca post Marlene de Rios's work.
Yeah, I mean, this is how you attract people, is you create a kind of image of a shaman that will sell well to the non-Indians. And you don't want to select someone that's also doing harm, right? Like Aurelio, supposedly, whether that's true or not. But at any rate, you want to sell them an image that doesn't that doesn't keep them from going down for the ceremonies.
Right. Well, and Wasson focuses a lot on Aurelio's image in his description. He says, Aurelio was a one-eyed butcher. He smoked a cigar and he sweated profusely.
So he was actually using tobacco, which is a native sacrament, and so he may have been less Christianized. My guess, just from hearing that, he probably is less Christianized than Maria Sabina.
But very much less marketable. If you're sending a bunch of foreign tourists in, you don't want a sweaty, stinky guy smoking a cigar with one eye who's a butcher.
No, you're right. So the tourism had a beneficial impact. Now, why are we, referring to all of this as archaic revival? There's two ways to look at archaic revival. One is that it can prevent the natives from losing self-esteem, and then it's easy to become an alcoholic or whatever. That's not positive, or it's increasing their income and allowing for that to occur instead of developing credits for agriculture or for animal husbandry. In other words, it's a way to keep them out of the mainstream. That's what I'm trying to say.
Let me ask you what you think that the Mazatec may have thought when they saw this whole fake remarketing of their religion and everything, and then basically the whole Mazatec community ends up participating in Wasson's lie for the tourists.
That's a really interesting question. I think Maria Sabina in the end was disgusted by it all.
Well, and she did try to expose Wasson.
So, I mean, the point, but here's the other part of it. Here's the other part of their agenda. It was to make sure that their agenda, meaning Haim, Wasson, and Moore, and all the others, Richardson, all the people that went on those CIA trips up there, they also wanted to synthesize, if they didn't already have it. They were making sure that they had all the species identified so that they could extract some chemical from them that then could be used by Timothy Leary or some other experimenter, prisoners, and insane.
We do know that Leary was keeping Wasson informed of all of the research at Harvard for the psilocybin research project, because in B.H. Friedman's book, he talks about Leary and Friedman going to Wasson's house and updating him on everything, and he's there describing how Wasson was actually a director of Sandoz, where the psilocybin was synthesized.
Well, this is the thing that people need to understand is, number one, the spying networks are international. So you get, French and Germans involved whenever and wherever you need to. It's not nationality is no obstacle to alliances that have to do with these projects of people like Wasson, because you need experts in these countries. And so maybe
Wasson brought in the chemist Albert Hoffman, who Hank Albarelli exposes as French intel and CIA.
Right. That's right.
And he brings in Roger Haim from the French National Museum, who's an expert mycologist.
Right.
And so he's and then he brings in a photographer, Alan Richardson. We can see that he's putting together a whole crew.
Exactly, and the same thing can be said about the collaboration between Wasson and Benitez. Benitez was the government's man in Huautla de Jimenez, and so they wanted probably to have some collaboration. Whether they agreed on everything is unlikely, but clearly there would have been some touristic benefits for the Mazatec. So probably Benitez said, "Why shouldn't I do this?" Right?
Yeah. Well, so then Benitez, in that sense, would be guilty for going along with the fake sale, or with the sale of a fake religion. He would have had to have been complicit in that, most likely.
It's hard for me to say.
Or do you think that maybe Wasson just took it on his own and went to loose and published it in time and launched the whole thing, regardless?
Yeah, I do, because before Benitez even gets involved, and I think it was in 1961 he was first involved, Benitez. It was already exploding and creating interest in the Mazatec from outsiders by the time Benitez was there. But
Benitez was there in 53, and then 57 is when the explosion of popularity happens.
Exactly, but he wasn't positioned until he was appointed in 1960 in Huautla.
Right.
And so by that time, I'm imagining, and I'm totally right, I'm imagining there were the pioneers of the psychedelic movement were already headed for Huautla de Jimenez, or had been there by 1960.
When did he first start working in Huautla?
1960.
So he wasn't there before 1960 at all?
He was. He says that starting in 1951, he began to have some contacts with the Mazatec. But
then he was. We know at least he was going up in there for another 9 years.
He was there before 60, but he was not officially in a position until 1960, where he could, on a day-to-day basis, deal with economic issues with the Huautla de Jimenez and the Highland Mazatec. So clearly the collaboration here is going to be beneficial in terms of some tourism for the Mazatec. I'm not sure that that means that I like it, because, as you point out, what does this do to the authentic shamans who see that their religion is being turned into a commodity, that their ceremony for divination and healing is being bastardized and sold as a religion? I think this is your point also.
Right, and it had already been co-opted by the Spaniards in the
Yeah.
1600s.
They'd already suppressed it.
Okay, and so then, it's, and Maria Sabina admits, that she was a devout Catholic. She says, let me just find this quote for you right here. Maria Sabina says, I belonged to the Sisterhood for 30 years. Now I belong to the Sisterhood of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. The Sisterhood is composed of 10 women. Each member is a so-called mother, and no wonder Mother Maria Sabina, all these words. Our task consists of making candles and gathering money to pay for the Mass that is given monthly, and thanks to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And then she also admits, and I talked about earlier the so-called veladas, she admits that, and you can read it in the book by Alvaro Estrada that, it was written with her and him. He translated the whole book for her. But she admits in there that all of her songs are sung to Jesus, and they're Christian songs. But she says, quote, during my vigils, I speak to the saints, to Lord Santiago, to Saint Joseph, and to Mary. I say the name of each one as they appear. I know that God is formed by all the saints. Just as we together form humanity, God is formed by all the saints. That's why I don't have a preference for any saint. All the saints are equal. One has the same force as the other. None has more power than another. And, so going on here, what she also says, contradicting Wasson and the whole lot of these guys, is that she says, quote, before Wasson, nobody took the mushrooms only to find God. They were always taken for the sick to get well. And then she states later on in Estrada's book, it was difficult for me to explain. She's talking about all of the hippie tourists. Well, I'll just read this whole little passage here.
Sure.
For a time, there came young people of one and the other sex, long hair with strange clothes. They wore shirts, and this is, an indigenous Indian saying their clothes are strange. They wore shirts of many colors and used necklaces. A lot came. Speaking of the tourist industry, some of these young people sought me out to stay up with the little ones who spring forth. We come in search of God, they said. It was difficult for me to explain to them that the vigils weren't done for the simple desire to find God, but were done with the sole purpose of curing the sickness that our people suffer from.
Good point. Let me follow up, because this is such an important point, and Wasson well knew this. This is a quote that's in Benita's book that we're referring to, Volume 3, Los Indios en Mexico. And on page 212, Benitez is quoting a letter that was written to Wasson, the 9th of March in 1950.
Is that Eunice Pike?
Yes, Eunice Pike's letter. Okay, so I'm gonna translate just a little bit of this letter that came from Eunice Pike to Gordon Wasson in March of 1953. The Mazatecs rarely speak about their mushroom to any outsider. One boy that was 21 years old told me, meaning Eunice Pike, the following, quote, I know that the foreigners don't use the mushroom because Jesus gave it to us because we are poor and we can't pay a doctor and we can't pay for expensive medicines. So the mushrooms.
Oh, slam dunk. Well, and here's
a gift to the
here's more evidence that Wasson knew that they were only used for medicine and not for God. Right. In Persephone's Quest, he states, I have one more publication to report in the Mexican field. In 1958, I taped a complete ceremony of Maria Sabina's velada. Notice that loaded word again. And we have come to call the customary nighttime session. Notice he says it's customary. A boy about 17 years old had contracted a serious illness when working down in the hot country. Something was gravely wrong with his liver or kidney. Maria Sabina would devote her healing velada,
Right.
to asking the mushrooms whether the boy would live or die, and if he was to live, what he should do to recover. The verdict, however, was that the boy had to die. Within weeks, he was dead. And so basically, Wasson admits that it's a customary nighttime session and that Maria Sabina was healing a 17-year-old boy who died weeks later. And then, of course, curandero comes from a healer.
Yes.
And, Wasson just disregarded all of that. Even though he talks about it, he kind of whitewashes it over and makes it all look like it was this god religious ceremony that she was doing.
Not only that, but he's hiding the poverty of the Mazatecs. Why do they have to leave the highlands and go down and work in the lowlands? Because the wealthy Mexicans have the ranches and the farms down in the lowlands, and the poor Mazatecs need that money, and they have to leave their homes and be exposed to infectious disease and unsanitary working conditions. And that's why they get sick, is because they're poor.
Very good point.
You never hear this from any of these New Agers, and nor, of course, Wasson either. And
right.
that's why I know Benitez is not totally co-opted by the intelligence agencies. He's telling us the real story about what these poor Mazatecs have to deal with.
And, I want to reiterate again because, in my article, Enthusians, What's in a Name, I reiterate all of the things that the Mexicans, the Mazatec were known to use mushrooms for, and none of the things sold by Wasson or, McKenna at all, the whole New Age crowd. I mean, defenders, people like even people that I had on the show before, like Professor John Hups, want people to believe that Terrence McKenna was recruited by the mushrooms or by a UFO.
Yeah, I love it.
Hold on just a second. Let me cover these points here, because aside from healing, which we just made clear, these are all of the things that the Mazatec use the mushroom for, and none of them include UFOs or the mushrooms giving jobs or providing money. And so here's what they say, and this is Wasson admitting it. The natives told us of other wonders within the power of the mushroom. 1, if a young wife vanishes, the mushroom tells in a vision where she is. 2, if money has disappeared from a secret place, the mushroom reveals who has it and where it is. 3, if the burro has disappeared, the mushroom says whether he is stolen and toward what market he is being driven for sale, or else whether it has fallen into a baraka where he lies with a broken leg. 4, if a boy in the family has gone into the world, perhaps to the States, the mushroom will bring news of him. The Indians are agreed on these matters. Nowhere, no UFOs, no giving them jobs. It says where to locate money, stolen money, but it doesn't say that the mushrooms are going to magically manifest money and get someone out of trouble with Interpol and the FBI, stuff like that. So basically we have finding a young cheating wife, looking for stolen money, finding a missing jackass, and tracking down a boy who's gone into the world, and healing. Those are the only known uses that the Mazatecs had for the mushroom.
Right, and these are things. Let's think for just a moment. Maybe we don't have to spend a lot of time, but these are things that the military intelligence people would be very keenly interested in. Locating an enemy, for example, knowing where they are, when they're going to attack, where they're going to attack. I mean, these are all things that the Mazatec, for lack of a better word, shamans knew firsthand, because they were using the mushrooms over the course of a lifetime. And so they do remote sensing and all these fancy things that the CIA and the military would be interested in, right?
Now, presumably, but of course, the onus of proof falls on somebody able to do that stuff. And,
of course.
Aldous Huxley talks about, magic and anthemas and things being used for social control in his work. And he's, and so in my opinion, parapsychology and all of this stuff is, to take advantage of the credulity of the victim.
Yeah, you're looking at it more as a selling point to get the New Agers sucked into a kind of a containment plan.
But at the same
That's part of it.
though, couldn't a high-ranking shaman have figured this stuff out and used it for the same purpose?
No, because they'd be discovered. If I were a shaman, you have to go along when the warriors attack. It's not like being a general or a CIA agent and you're in Washington while they're in Afghanistan getting shot at. If you're a shaman, you're on the warpath with everybody else. So if you don't produce results, you turn out to be a faker, they're not going to tolerate you.
Let me see if I'm just looking for that citation from Aldous Huxley.
No, I'm sure Huxley wants to believe, that wants us to believe that there's a reality to these altered states of consciousness. That's clearly been his position right along on it. And I don't think that they're all cynics. I think some of them are, and probably Huxley were among them. Some of them are also believers that these things may exist, and they want to know more.
Sure.
But
there's still the issue of the onus of proof, though, and that's always a tough one,
Well, yeah, and let me follow up in a positive way on that. Yes, there are not enough longitudinal studies of shamanic healing. So how do we know if a year later someone who was supposedly in remission is still in remission because the anthropologist is there and gone? So I'm totally on board with you. We need better evidence. We need anthropologists and psychologists to do longitudinal studies of these so-called ritual healings. I agree with you.
And back to Marlene de Rios, she did a lot of that down in Peru and Iquitos with with the ayahuasca shamans down there, and she showed that the huge majority of them were frauds, but there were a few real cures amongst them.
That's probably true.
But if they had real magic power or not is a whole different issue, but at least they were honest cures.
Yeah, it's a whole different issue, and it varies from time to time and place to place. But these are important questions for research, for honest research that have not really been done. And why is that?
Jay, I'm not sure there are any other ethnobotanists out there other than you and I who want to do honest research.
Well, let's go back to our main theme for a minute. Let's go back to our main theme. Why is it that spies hide in academic clothing?
Good segue. Good job.
Yeah, because Jan, to me, what you just said is really profound, is why aren't more people doing these kinds of longitudinal studies and telling us things that we need to know about whether these ritual healings are permanent or not. And to me, also the fact that when we expose the spies, as clearly you and I have done with Meyerhoff and Castaneda, and I'm waiting for Peter first to file, so we can file a Freedom of Information Act on him.
Yeah, or to sue you or me for putting all this out so that we can drag him into the court. But I think what they don't want is a real court battle. I think what they're trying to do is call the bluff.
Yes, I'm now a believer in that too, and that's why they defame us and they defamed Allegro before us, because they want to do the down and dirty thing as easily as possible without having to honestly provide any evidence of who they are and what they're really doing. But the fact that the American Anthropological Association Ethics Committee disbanded after three of us wanted them to do an inquiry about first.
Oh, they disbanded.
They disbanded.
I didn't realize they had disbanded.
They disbanded. So let me make this as clear as I can. To me, we have two diametrically opposed objectives. The legitimate scholar, the honest scholar, is trying to give us what they can verify as true and present an explanation, either a native explanation or their own explanation, but based on things that they've actually researched and tried to determine are true for the people where they've done their research. But the intelligence community is not interested in just facts alone. They're interested in meeting other objectives like
Jay,
control for the masses.
Jay, if there's one thing I've realized that the intelligence community hates beyond anything else, it's primary citations.
Yes.
I mean, they all cite each other. They all use secondary citations, and you and I can even explain how we've figured out how these guys are dirty, and these academic cells and stuff,
They
because
cite each other. Yeah.
they're usually 3 to 5 of these guys in each cell. They cite each other. Some of the cells will cross-cite other cells. But when you look into these little cells and you try to find the primary documentation, they're all just cross-citing each other, and it goes nowhere, just in a loop. And then this is how you discover if you're dealing with a spy cell or not.
Yes, I think it's one test, because if you're fabricating, it helps to have a conspiracy, because then it gives the appearance to the outsider that, oh my God, well, if all 3 of these people have all said the same thing and they've observed the same thing, like waterfall jumping or whatever it might be, then of course it's got to be true because there's a consensus. Well, sure, there was a consensus that Garbo, the famous World War II Spanish spy, created to mislead the Germans into thinking that the actual invasion was not going to occur at Normandy, but further up the coast at Calais. So, yeah, I mean, this is what it takes to disinform people is more than one person saying the same thing.
So, and in my new article, and again, it's Spies in Academic Clothing, I cite a few instances of doing this, and what I want to do is read an instance from Bill Clinton's professor, Carol Quigley at Georgetown University, if I can find it here. He says, by the interaction of these various branches on one another, under the pretense that each branch was an autonomous power, the influence of each branch was an autonomous power. I guess that is correct. The influences of each branch was increased through a process of mutual reinforcement.
Exactly.
The unanimity. Thank you. Good boy, my tongue twisted on that one. Among the various branches was believed by the outside world to be the result of the influence of a single truth, while it was the result of the existence of a single group. Thus, the statesman, a member of the group, announces a policy. About the same time, the Royal Institute of International Affairs publishes a study on the subject, and an Oxford Don, a fellow of All Souls and a member of the group, also publishes a volume on the subject, probably through a publishing house like G. Bell & Sons or Faber & Faber, allied to the group. The statesman's policy is subjected to critical analysis and final approval in a leader in the Times, while the 2 books are reviewed in a single review in the Times Literary Supplement, which is the paper where Wasson just so happened to attack John Allegro. Both the leader and the review are anonymous, but are written by the members of the group. And finally, at about the same time, an anonymous article in the Round Table strongly advocates the same policy. This cumulative effect of such tactics as this, even if each tactical move influences only a small number of important people, is bound to be great.
Yes. Great quote. I hope people understand that, because that's exactly how disinformation becomes accepted by the masses, is that process of mutual reinforcement of fabrications. That's exactly it. Whether it's Garbo misleading the Germans and his friends, or whether it's First and Meyerhoff and Castaneda misleading people about the Huichol, the process is the exact same.
So how David Black explains this process in Acid is, he says from page 150, the conspiracy starts with 3 people. These 3 people in turn recruit 2 other people to form 3 new cells. This recruitment process continues until a large network of cells is built up. The advantage of the structure is that if the cell members do not know each other's subcells, then they cannot give them away if captured. The drawback is that if a single cadre is arrested and cannot resist interrogation, then the enemy can arrest the half dozen comrades he or she knows and thus reach the subcells. A more sophisticated system discussed in Heiling's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, is a pyramid of pyramids set up a sort of internet without computers.
The interesting thing, though, is when there's a kind of discovery of deception, they appoint a damage control person, and in the case of Castaneda, that was clearly Richard DeMille. So the damage control person, does only a partial job because they don't want people to see the wider conspiracy.
You're exactly right. So Richard DeMille, so they're going to out Carlos Castaneda. He gets a little too out there and his cult gets way too big. So they out him. Richard DeMille does that. You come along trying to investigate the whole thing later on, and then Richard DeMille misleads your research, and he ends up being an agent as well.
Exactly.
And then... we see this exact same thing in other areas as well. Also,
sure. So the intelligence agency. I mean, what's really interesting to me is they operate by fraud and conspiracy. What we've just been discussing is exactly fraud and conspiracy. And even this popular movie Argo, what is that but fraud and conspiracy to get the hostages out of Iran after the Revolutionary Guard took over in 1979. So clearly the fraud and conspiracy is essential to intelligence, whether it's military or whether it's these academics that are really spies. Spies pretend.
And and Iran has always, hated us, never mind that we overthrew their president.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Never mind all
Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. The Iranians, they're just evil. They're just bad people. They're evil. We didn't do anything to provoke all of that.
Right. So exactly. I mean, there's always that denial that we had anything to do with them hating us in return. but anyway, the process here is really quite interesting, and it's almost ludicrous that so many otherwise intelligent people would immediately use fraud and conspiracy as something that never existed, as if there's never been military intelligence based on it, which for at least 5,000 years we know has been the case, and probably even prior to that, because what is essential to an ambush...
Jay, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Oh, you bet, because we survived. We survived as a people, and this is where you and I may be slightly part company, but that's okay, because some of these military operations that involve fraud and conspiracy, I'm all for, but I wish we could eliminate the intelligence.
I've yet to figure out how statism that uses fraud and coercion to tax people and everything else can ever operate. And Larkin Rose has shown this, but how it could ever operate without fraud and coercion.
It can't. And frankly, I think I'm a pessimist because I see how much fraud and conspiracy and coercion there is throughout the world. What do we do when we have China and Russia increasing their military budgets by 150% or so? I mean, we can't trust them. They can't trust us. We've got spies running around. They've got spies running around. They've got hackers. We've got hackers. I mean, how are we ever going to have a world based on peace until we can get control over intelligence agencies?
I got a bigger. What do all of these intelligence agencies have in common? They're all part of the state. They're all statists.
Yes.
So if we got rid of the state and we became a voluntarist society, and without, then you wouldn't need that coercion. I mean, even the army and military of the U.S. is illegal. It's it's in the Constitution. There shouldn't be a standing army. So why the hell is there an army?
Well, imagine a world without those things. John Lennon did, and what happened to him?
Well, here, hold on a second.
We're getting a little far out here.
Yeah, John, you mean? John Lennon. He goes by Mark Stacer now.
Oh. But I meant the John Lennon that did Imagine.
Right. He goes by Mark Stacer now.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. You're correct.
You're talking about another psychological never mind.
Okay. All right, let's cut that off. Let's go back to where we were. That that fraud and conspiracy is the sine non qua non of intelligence in the military as well as in the CIA, and that they're using the same tactics now to create the archaic revival. We've seen 3 waves of it in Mexico alone, and now probably the ayahuasca is another example of
I
this.
think undoubtedly it is.
Sure,
And
sure.
you look at, you got the same, people, the same associated people, and the same cells cross-siting each other, and all this academic fraud. I do think that in a tea laced with controversy, I do think that Marlene de Rios, before she died 2 years ago, may have tried to expose the whole thing and stop it. I think she probably began to feel guilty about her earlier
Yes.
actions.
This is a very interesting question that I think a book needs to be written on, which is some of these agents actually, I think, become remorseful. What happened to William Colby? He committed suicide. What happened to Sidney Gottlieb? Evidently, he dropped out and became like a new age farmer, right? I mean, and probably she's a good example. Marlene, whom I met, Dobkin de Rios. So yes, some of them I think do actually regret what they did and didn't do as agents. Yeah.
Yeah, and Marlene and I, we had lunch scheduled for like 2 years at this Thai restaurant in Fullerton, because she worked at Cal State Fullerton. And, but she ended up dying before we ever got to have lunch. So
Yeah.
it was both of our favorite restaurant too. So that was how it happened.
Well, there's a personal element to all this. I mean, Bateson was someone I truly, truly thought of as a genius. And let's not go into what that word means, but it meant to me that he was a thinker that is way above the ordinary. And of course, that's the person that the CIA wants.
And then, of course, you discover that your pal was behind all this academic fraud. So let's talk about that. Talk about.
He was the one that launched the archaic.
Talk about, because you used to hang out with Bateson. So, talk about your interaction with him and how it felt when you discovered that he was a fraud.
I'm not sure I would want to use that word fraud. Let's say it this way. He was an intelligence agent in academics' clothing.
Well, he was the one who basically marketed this whole native revivalism that we're dealing with, where all of this fraud stems out of. So how is he not the kingpin of the fraud?
He's one of them. But here, let's talk a bit about what archaic revival means from the standpoint of viewing it against the previous policies. The previous policy toward American Indians was acculturate them, either kill them or acculturate them, so that we can get control of their lands, we meaning the Europeans. So that policy of assimilation or annihilation, genocide, was reversed with this idea of self-determination. It was strongly reversed, and archaic revival is kind of a lesser form of self-determination. It's more limited because you're not really giving them freedom or help without some sacrifice or harm occurring at the same time. The tourism is insidious, Jan. The tourism is insidious because it commoditizes their ceremonies and turns them into something done primarily for outsiders rather than for the benefit of their own people.
Right.
So I don't like it. I don't like archaic revival.
Well, and not only that, but it's done for a religious purpose that they never even used it for.
That's right. But that's the other face of it. Remember, we're talking about the inside face, which is I'm getting money because the outsiders want to go on a peyote hunt or want to have mushrooms.
Right. Which is exactly the same case with the now I'm forgetting the word for the the mestizo shamans down in Peru.
Exactly. So I don't like archaic revival. Now, but you have to think in terms of the way these agents, like my dear ex-friend Bateson, what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out, okay, we don't really want the system to change in any basic way, meaning that the 99% would have more control over their economic lives, right? That
right.
The 1%
to keep the 99 down, right?
Keep the 99 down, exactly. So their premise starts with that. And so I'll never completely see eye to eye with them, because I'm a true Democrat. I'd like to see what the Native American societies like the Lakota and Huichol had, which is more of the 99% controlling over the 1% shamans that were the elite.
So,
but, what I want to finish saying though is about this policy of control through CIA creation of celebrities, whether it's Maria Sabina or Ramon Medina Silva or some ayahuasca shaman. This is a very key element of their strategy. And you point that out on the first page of this article you're working on the misleading MK Ultra research. And you cite this author, Francis Stonor Saunders, talking about the CIA being involved in publication of at least 1,000 books. And that was back in 1977. And the money for this is all hidden from view. There's like a 5% kickback basically whenever the government of the United States donates some foreign aid to another country. Don't they hide like 5% of that?
Right, and that's from Saunders as well.
Yeah.
See, here's another issue with, or several more issues with Bateson. So David Black, in his book Acid, page 11, states that Bateson dosed agents Ken Kesey and Allen Ginsberg. And, of course, we know what happened from there.
I know.
Abramson dosed Bateson.
Yeah,
and then General Wild Bill Donovan brought Bateson in to explain why the OSS needed to be converted into the CIA. So Bateson is technically the originator of the CIA.
Well, like I said, it was a genius. What am I going to say, Jan?
But a conniving genius. I mean, it's like when you get into that stuff, he's, and what about that native revival study that Joe and I talked about in Manufacturing the Deadhead? We still don't know where that anthropological study is.
I don't like it either. The fact that we still don't know what exactly this archaic revival is based on, supposedly from the Soviet Union. So yeah, I mean, it stinks. I don't like archaic revival either. I've denounced it as much as I can. But here's the thing though, that about Bateson. Remember, we just talked about these agents who later in life have some remorse. I think Bateson was one of those too. I think, when you step away from your life and you're older, you start thinking back about some of the things that maybe you shouldn't have done, or that you.
That's presuming that they weren't psychopaths and had feelings.
No, Bateson. Well, in Bateson's case, in Castaneda's case, and I'll say this publicly anytime, I'm now pretty sure that he was also a psychopath as well as whatever else he might have been. But Bateson, I do not feel was a psychopath.
Well, the one thing that psychopaths are good at, though, is pretending that they're normal people.
Oh, there you go. I can't disagree with that.
I mean, look at, he's the one who launched Ken Kesey and Allen Ginsberg over in Greenwich Village. Ginsberg then goes over to the institute that we were talking about with Lydia. So, I mean, it's all tied right together. We're exposing Bateson's crap.
Here's what I have to say about that.
What was the Naropa Institute? Sorry, go ahead.
The Naropa and Esalen. Here's what I can say. If what you said is true, then Bateson fooled me too, because I didn't detect that about him. With Castaneda, I never met him. He didn't want to obviously be exposed. I think I could have detected he was a phony had I met him. But Bateson, I didn't detect any kind of deceit coming from him toward me. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't use it elsewhere, because obviously he must have as an intelligence agent.
Well, I mean, it's everywhere. When you look at all of this stuff, it goes to Bateson and to Aldous Huxley,
Yeah. But both of them were incredibly brilliant people. The only thing I will say is they also seem to be allies more of the 1% than the 99%.
Well, that's for sure.
So that we can agree on. That we can definitely agree. But let's say one more thing about these this sort of covert action that's off the books, because this money that Francis Stonor Saunders is talking about, I wish you'd explain a bit more about that to people, because we're talking about what, 200 million a year or more?
Well, and that article was written 30 years ago.
So in fact, didn't she say that there was so much money they couldn't even spend it all?
Well, they called it candy. So let me just read that
Talking a little bit.
passage here. So this is from page 105 from Frances Stonner Saunders' book, The Cultural Cold War. She says, quote, "The key to all of this is the counterpart funds. Lawrence de Neuville later revealed people couldn't say in U.S. Congress, oh, look what they're doing with taxpayer money because it wasn't our money. It was a byproduct of the Marshall Plan," which of course was still our money. In an innovative move under the early years of the Marshall Plan, it was proposed that in order to make funds perform double duty, each recipient, I suppose if you invested in these funds, that's where you would get super rich like these guys too. It was proposed that in order to make the funds perform double duty, each recipient country should contribute to the foreign aid effort by depositing an amount equal to the U.S. contribution in its central bank. A bilateral agreement between the country and the U.S. allowed these funds to be used jointly. The bulk of the currency funds, 95%, remained the legal property of the country's government, while 5% became, upon deposit, the property of the U.S. government. These counterpart funds, a secret fund of roughly $200 million a year, and this is decades ago, were made available through the war chest for the CIA. Now, Irving Brown was able to boost his CIA slush fund with Marshall Plan candy. Mm-hmm. And then she goes on regarding candy that we couldn't spend it all. I remember once meeting with Wisner and the comptroller. My God, I said, how can we spend that? There were no limits. Nobody had to account for it. It was amazing.
It was amazing. And isn't it really fraud and conspiracy between the two countries?
Hey, I mean, you know.
My, let's not call things by their real name. It's just a mutual agreement.
And you know, the term conspiracy theory was a marketing campaign by the Warren Commission, in fact.
Oh, yeah. So
okay, let me just pull that up real quick.
We know that there's so much money that they have to work with that's off the books.
Richard Hofstadter was the first to use it in his The New Right, and it was also created by the Warren Commission. It's an appeal to ridicule. Cass Sunstein may have been behind that, but James F. Tracy has done some work to expose that.
So this is an incredibly important issue that really very few people have wanted to deal with. I don't hear the mainstream media talking about these things at all. Right?
The same mainstream media run by all of them, by the Central Entertainment Agency.
So yeah, I mean, what we have is they have the means, they've got a lot of money, they have the opportunity because they're hiding their true identity, and they have the intelligence to pull off all kinds of things, which we've started to
all right, equivocation on intelligence.
Yes. What kind of genius was Bateson? But anyway, I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of looking at these four different aspects of archaic revival and how there's two faces to that. There's the face that's turned inward toward the native peoples, or the mestizos in the case of the ayahuasqueros. And then we have the outside face, which is the New Agers who are flooding the Mazatec, the Huichol, and the ayahuasqueros and the Mayans in search of a new religion, I guess, because some of them don't need healing.
Well, and what about, let's look at ayahuasca for a second, because we have a rubber tapper who started the whole ayahuasca religion in like the 1910s or 20s or something. And so was this and when we look at the indigenous of Peru and Brazil, et cetera, didn't they use ayahuasca to purge parasites from their stomach more than they used it for, religious purposes? And then, we need to go back and study Marlene's work and the rest of them and see if they fabricated all of, the Shipibo Canibo, material, et cetera.
Doing that. Someone should be doing that, but I don't know who can and who will. But
anybody have the time? There's a research lead.
But you know what? Here's the thing, though. Again, the idea of telepathy, wasn't it originally called telepathine? I mean, wouldn't the military be interested in knowing how to mind control somebody because you could read their thoughts? If indeed that is possible, which of course you and I might differ on. But at any rate, yeah, I mean, they were interested in these things for a long, long time before it got marketed to the New Ages. I'm sure of it.
Absolutely.
And so with the ayahuasqueros, you're referring to the Wizard of the Upper Amazon, but really wasn't it the forward of Andrew Weil that helped launch that as a kind of public property?
Andrew Weil, did you just say that?
I did.
Out loud. Jeez.
I thought that
You
was
mean the same one who got Leary fired from Harvard, that launched the whole Hegelian dialectic that allowed Leary to pretend that his spiritual message was being suppressed, and it was a total benefit for the CIA and him that he got fired? That Andrew Weil?
That's right. Scandals are very important because they generate publicity.
Indeed. I didn't realize Weil was behind that one too. So you'll have to send me some research on Weil and the connection to ayahuasca, and I'll plug that into the database.
Andrew Weil, another person whom I admire, I met once, and tried to.
Oh, I've met him a bunch of times.
I tried to tell him about First, and right away he said, "First is my friend. I don't want to hear about this."
Yeah. Well, yeah, he also works with the Hollyhock Institute, and that's UN Agenda 21. He was involved in nonviolent communication, which goes up to Carl Rogers, MK Ultra Subproject 97, Tides Canada, the Haven Institute, etc. And he worked with Alan Watts, who we vetted. He worked with Allen Ginsberg, also at the Hollyhock Institute. Allen Ginsberg was MK Ultra, the Greenwich Village team in New York.
Right. So these scandals are certainly important because they generate publicity about things that the intelligence agency wants people to get interested in, right? It grabs attention.
Well, in the direction that they want, creating a Hegelian dialectic and reversing the truth about it, and using Kabbalah magic or whatever they want to do to send it the other direction.
Exactly. So when you want to switch directions, it's convenient to have as much publicity built up for the person that's going to be the point person to switch directions, as Timothy Leary was in making LSD illegal, right?
And in fact, regarding Andrew Weil, I interviewed Curtis Duncan again a couple of months ago, and in the middle of that video, we exposed that the so-called PBA-free bottles, water bottles that were going out there, they were being marketed by Andrew Weil. They weren't actually PBA-free or whatever, and that was a big scandal. And so that was episode number 221, if people want to check that out.
I'm sure not all of these scandals are intentional. Some are and some aren't. I'm not saying that they're all intentional.
Well, that particular group all stems out kind of around the Harvard Social Relations Department.
That is probably intentional.
I'm kind of, when they're all social relations people, and Weil sells the whole vegetarian scam, et cetera, that was, has been disproved time and time again. And I fell for that and got sick for years. But when you get into that and look at how he promotes that, he used to sit out on the lawn at the Federal Building with us at the California Hemp Initiative rallies in L.A., 20 years ago. I used to, I talked to him a number of times, but he always said that trans fats weren't real and that you didn't have to worry about your hemp seed oil in a clear bottle sitting out in the sun without being sealed. And that, that was the first time I got major red flags from Weil when he told me that directly, while he was sitting on the lawn at the Federal Building.
Well, all I can say is, he's the one that, as you said, was credited with having exposed Leary.
Exposed, quote
in quotes. And then he's also the one who's forward promoted the first famous ayahuasquero, Manuel Córdoba Rios. So, he's clearly interested in these things. And eventually we may, if we outlive him, be able to find out whether what he's doing
is... They're trying to get rid of the whole FOIA request thing right now. But here, let me read what I wrote regarding Weil in the new article. And again, I renamed it to Spies in Academic Clothing per your recommendation. But
that title.
One thing that is difficult to understand is the fable regarding Tim Leary's getting fired from Harvard in 1963 and the exposure by Dr. Andrew Weil. It appears from the evidence that Weil's quote-unquote exposure was just an old trick using the Hegelian dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Without Leary having been fired from Harvard, he'd never have been able to create the appearance of the hippie guru he'd later used to promote psychedelics to the youth for the CIA and Huxley and Osmond. Weil's so-called exposure and Leary's subsequent firing, along with Dr. Richard Alpert, created the illusion that Harvard et al. Were trying to suppress Leary's spiritual message. This gave Leary and the CIA the psychological advantage that they'd need to use against the public. And, after all, Leary and the others were nearly all out of the Harvard Social Relations Department under well-known MKUltra conspirator Dr. Henry A. Murray, who headed the department.
You know, what's really interesting about that is we can see a kind of pattern emerging. Leary transforming from scientist into the high priest of LSD. Carlos Castaneda transforming from anthropologist into the high priest of sorcery.
Michael J. Harner?
And Harner, yeah, he's the high priest of shamanism now. That's right. So, you know, they have the academic credentials, and then they suddenly get into a scandal, or they suddenly transcend being mere academics and create some social movement. Or
cult. They decide that the fraud aspect is more fun and more fulfilling than academia and credibility, you know.
Well, let's take Leary. I don't know about Harner or Castaneda as much as now I think we know about Leary. Humphrey Osmond was very important in terms of the mescaline that he gave to Aldous Huxley.
Which was the exact same day that MKUltra was funded.
Yes. And then what did they do? Together they went to recruit Timothy Leary and transform him from being a scientist psychologist into being this public figure who was selling LSD to the masses, and then who later wanted to make it illegal. But why make something illegal that prior to 1966 you were extolling the virtues of? This is where I don't get it. I'm just a dumb academic. What happened? Did he see the light and realize it was so dangerous it should just now finally be made illegal?
Yeah, well, you know, and I have Leary's transcript when he goes before Congress to request LSD's outlaw. But that's not the official story. The official story is that the government came down on LSD and psychedelics because of Leary. They never talk about Leary going to Congress and asking for them to regulate it and shut it down. And so, quoting Senator Dodd, don't you think that the drugs need to be put under control and restriction? Leary, pardon, sir? Senator Dodd, let me rephrase my question. Don't you feel that LSD should be put under some control or restriction as to its use? Dr. Leary, yes, sir. Senator Dodd, as to its sale and possession and its use? Leary, I definitely do. In the first place, I think that the 1965 Drug Control Act, which this committee, I understand, sponsored, is the high watermark in such legislation. And then continuing a few pages later, Leary says, sir, I agree completely with your bill. The 1965 Drug Control Act, I think, is the Senator Dodd, that the federal government and state governments ought to control it. Dr. Leary, exactly. I'm in 100% agreement with the 1965 Drug Control Bill. Senator Kennedy, so there shouldn't be. Dr. Leary, I wish the states, I might add, would follow the wisdom of this committee and the Senate and Congress of the United States and follow your lead with exactly that kind of legislation. Senator Kennedy, so there should not be an indiscriminate distribution of this drug, should there? Dr. Leary, I've never suggested that, sir. No. I'm lying out my rear, but I have never urged anyone to take LSD. I have always deplored the indiscriminate use or unprepared use, and that's from the Narcotic Rehabilitation Act of 1966, hearings before a special subcommittee, 89th Congress, second session, and that's from pages 246 and 250.
You know, the thing that all of this is going to lead me to say is maybe not something we're going to include, but I'll leave it to you. I think these intelligence agents were smart enough to realize that they could not control the effects of LSD and mescaline and psilocybin and other things that were sold as those chemicals, right?
Right.
That weren't. And I think they were smart enough to realize that the shamans, the real shamans that I've met anyway, and probably Maria Sabina, the real shamans knew how to use these sacred plants that were the source of at least of the psilocybin and the mescaline, not of the LSD.
Well, but they did market a whole false religion, whereas Maria
Yes.
used it in a very controlled setting.
Yes, but it still was safer, I think, for the people to be sent out of the U.S., people that wanted to experiment. Safer to go to the Huichol, the Mazatec, the ayahuasqueros, and have people that actually knew how to use these powerful substances in the,
You mean, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying.
what
Say
I'm
for that group of people.
You see
Now,
what
since Terrence McKenna figured out how to grow them at home in the 1970s, everybody's been a home grower.
they can do it. They can do it themselves now. That's right. But initially, I think they realized that they did not know how to get positive effects by using LSD on all of the people that got it, whether it was through electric Kool-Aid acid or through the prisons or however they got it, whether they knew it or not, in hospitals in Canada, right? They didn't know most of the time. And so they made, what's the word I want? They made a turnaround, realizing perhaps that they were getting too many negative results the way they were using it.
Well, and that goes back to my last article, Entheogens, What's in a Name, and the whole remarketing from psychotomimetic to psychedelic to entheogen, so that they could alter the name itself, determine the outcome of the experience.
And parallel with that is the whole rise of this New Age shamanism.
Exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, that's where I was trying to go. So yes, we got there.
That's a good conclusion point right there. That brings it full circle.
I think we've done a good job, Jan.
All right. So instead of tomorrow morning us recording, now we have the morning off.
We're done.
All right, sir.
Take care. Do a good job.
Likewise, and keep the facts coming, and I'll keep sending them your way, and we'll keep flushing more of this crap out.
We did a good job. We bouncing off the other. We came up with a good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.